Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, Samiha told me that I have 20 minutes here, so I'm going to be rushed, unfortunately, because I have a lot of slides to go through. But I'll try and make a fair stab of it, or the best stab of it as I can. I'm sure it should keep me in check as we go along. So, managing inequality. Now, why inequality as such? Because from my perspective, a lot of work has been done in the concept of inequality over the last 40, 50 years. But very few pieces of research have been done regarding inequality and the impact of Islam or the Islamic perspective on inequality. And that's something that I want to pursue, and I want to start asking some questions behind that. The aim of this presentation is not to really come up with any prescriptions as such, but is to kind of understand a bit more clearly what these questions mean. Does inequality really matter? What is fairness? And so forth. And is to try and get at a more precision behind these questions that will drive us to more answers moving forward into our societies. And I'm especially focused around the Muslim world. So this is not really about what's happening in our community as such, but more across the Muslim world in general. So what does poverty and inequality really mean? Now, this chap here, anyone recognize him? Stephen Pinker, right? So Stephen Pinker talks a lot about the difference between poverty and inequality. He claims to say that poverty has actually reduced over the last 40 or 50 years. And I happen to agree with him because the levels of poverty from $1 or however you measure it has actually reduced over the last 40 years. But what he also goes on to say is that because poverty has reduced, inequality in itself doesn't really matter. But I beg to differ on that front because I think inequality has a lot of consequences, irrespective of the level of poverty in the society. Now, this is a graph that shows the gross inequity in our world today, where 1% of the population control about 38% of the world's wealth, and the bottom 50% of the population control only about 2% of the world's wealth. And I could have shown 100 graphs like this moving forward, which tell the same picture of what's happening in our world today. So what's going on in the Muslim world? Now, can anyone hazard a guess as to which is the most inequitable country in the world today? Anybody?
South Africa.
South Africa, I heard someone say, right? Which is actually correct, right? So probably an economist hiding in plain sight. So if you look at the middle graph here, I think what you notice is that the most inequitable country by a coefficient that we call the Gini coefficient is actually South Africa, followed by some of the more South American countries like Brazil and Chile. But if you notice the Gulf countries over there, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, they are still quite high on the inequality scale. But something to note here is that they don't include things like migrant labor, for example. That's not factored into those calculations. So if you factor that in, some of those countries that we often go on holiday to are the most inequitable nations in the world today. And that's something that we have to really bear in mind. Also something to note very quickly is the GDP of Yemen compared to a country which is in very close proximity to it, which is Qatar. So Qatar has a GDP per capita which is about 160 times that of Yemen. And yet they share the same foods, they have the same names, they have the same culture, they have the same religion. So it's something that is quite grotesque and incomprehensible in many ways. Has anyone seen this picture before, or pictures like it, right? So this is about equality of opportunity or outcome. So I won't spend too much time on it, just to say that everyone has an unequal start in life. And it's not so much about leveling the playing field, it's about creating a tilted playing field for many over in society. But tilting the playing field actually causes a number of economic inconsistencies because it causes a lot of effort, a lot of money to be spent in terms of doing that. Wouldn't it be better if we just took away the restrictions itself? Now, it's not just about money that we afford or resources that we allocate to people. It's also about their capability to use this. So Amartya Sen very famously did a lot of work in this respect called the capability model. And these pictures, I think, are self-explanatory in terms of the way they go. So I'm just going to move ahead in the interest of time. So why does economic justice and distributive justice really matter? It matters because it's part of a whole concept of justice that we need to see in our societies today. Whereas we have environmental justice, social justice, and restorative justice as well. And they all are interdependent upon each other. So much so that throughout Islamic history, for example, some elements of restorative justice were actually suspended because there was no economic justice within society. So we have to always bear that in mind, and that's why the level of inequality and economic justice really matters in society, because you cannot have anything else without it. If I was to talk to you about the drivers of inequality, normally people talk about health and education as being the downward spirals of inequality, that the less education you have, the more downward in terms of the spiral you are, and the more the more progressive the problem gets. But I think the thing that's least talked about is capital, because capital really matters. The amount of capital a person has determines their successes in life. And it's the inadequacy of this capital management or the unavailability of this capital that really determines our life chances in many ways. And so this also causes something to do with intergenerational mobility. Now, this is something that we call the Great Gatsby curve, which is a plot of all the countries, inequality on one side and the immobility or intergenerational immobility on the other side. As you can see, there's a cluster of Scandinavian countries in the bottom corner there, which is to be expected because they have low levels of inequality and hence a greater mobility of their generations. And similarly, you see South American countries and also countries, interesting countries like Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia, right at the top. But what's interesting here is the IDN over there, which is actually Indonesia, often called the most invisible place on earth, because it's least talked about geopolitically in many ways, or even economically. But as you can see, Indonesia must be doing something right, because its levels of inequality are actually at a comparable level to some of the Scandinavian and European countries. And its actual mobility is actually not that bad. It's actually on par with countries like Japan and Slovenia. Right, so why does inequality matter, apart from our social sense and treating our human beings on an equal level? It matters economically to a country because essentially poor people spend more into the economy than rich people do. And that's just a fact. And that costs a country about 1.5% of its GDP annually, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in GDP terms, it's actually huge. But the other thing to note is most of the countries from the Muslim world are actually developing countries. And what happens there is the inheritance of low levels of inequality aids the progress of developing countries. So we see a comparison between, for example, Korea and Taiwan, which had inherited low levels of inequality, developing much faster than countries in South Asia, like Pakistan, for example, which had inheritance of warped sense of land allocations that still continue to be the main drivers of inequality in that country. And just a quick word about some of the other consequences, health, education, and social consequences. Health-wise, we know countries with private health insurance actually end up spending more on health, and some people may talk about that later on. But it's also, the NHS always gets a bad press, but even if you were to look at the NHS economically, you see that every £1 spent on the NHS actually results in £4 of productivity for the whole nation. And that's something to bear in mind when we see all the trials and tribulations behind something like the NHS. Education, we know a lot has been done regarding accessibility and contextual admissions and so forth. But education is only half the bridge, it's only half the picture. It's also about building on those opportunities after education. And those opportunities actually have receded in the last 5 or 10 years, especially in this country. Just a word about social consequences. Homelessness, prison populations, they're a direct correlation of how inequality affects society. And we have a warped situation now whereby the increase in homelessness is also correlated to the increase in empty dwellings within a society. So you have this perverse kind of sense of, empty houses being around everywhere, whereas there's an increase in homeless people on our streets. So that's as a direct result of the society we live in. So now moving on to what Islam really says about inequality, right? So when looking at this, we have to compare it to the predominant system of our time, which is capitalism. Now, Lionel Robbins famously expressed the economic problem as a pursuit of unlimited wants with limited resources. Whereas in Islam, we have a slightly different perspective on this, where our perspective is about distribution of resources for limited needs, which paints a totally different philosophy on how we should view this problem. Essentially, capitalism has only one aspect to its fundamental nature, which is the acquisition of property and the disposal of property at any cost. Whereas what we find in Islam, we have a multi-layered incentive structure, which is not just material, but it's spiritual, it's environmental, and it's social at the same time. And this gives us a rich flavorings of how we carry out economic actions within society. Max Weber once said that capitalism is not just about trade. What it's also about is how we socially interact. And that social interaction is always about price. And this was famously demonstrated by Amartya Sen when he talked about the Bengal famine at the end of World War II, whereby in that famine, at the time of famine, grain was actually being shipped out of Bengal, not at the point of a gun, but at the point of price, because people were willing to pay more for it in other parts of the world. So that's how capitalism kind of is inbred to lead us to this sense of inequality within the world today. And just a word on charitable needs and benevolence. And this may sound a bit contentious, but capitalism really relies on that to solve the problems that it can't solve. And we have to be careful within the Muslim world and as Muslims not to over-rely on elements of capitalism or benevolence, because that often warps the economic picture. Sometimes it misallocates resources in the way that it should be allocated. And it needs to work alongside our overall economic picture, but not instead of our economic picture. So I'm just going to quickly rush through some of these now. There are many sayings in the Quran and in our texts and in our hadiths and in our rich heritage that talk about inequality and social and distributive justice. But I'm going to concentrate on the first two there, which is a hadith from Tirmidhi and from Ibn Majah, represented by the icons at the bottom, which is a right to food, clothing, and shelter for every citizen of a society. Now, what if that was ingrained within our constitutions as such? So problems like homelessness, for example, wouldn't be tackled as a periphery problems on the edge of society. They would have to be tackled as a basic right of a human being. So that's how we need to kind of perceive some of these problems, that they need to be tackled at the core of our being rather than as peripheral problems. And similarly with fire, water, and pastures, these are equivalent to things like utilities, energy, and our open spaces. And these reflect the fact that they cannot be privately owned in many ways. They need to be within the public domain. And that's what leads to another factor of equitable societies. Quick word on property rights. So property rights, as we've discussed in capitalism, is all about the allocation of property. When in Islam, we know that property is an amana for us. We are only custodians of that property. We are not owners of that property. So we are not free to acquire it and dispose of it as we wish. We are restricted by the rules and regulations within Islam. And just a word on allocation of land. Land in general, I'll talk about well, maybe not now, but Karachi land and Ushuri land. These are about making land benefited for productive uses. So much so that in Islamic history, there are instances where land has been taken away from people because it's not there for productive uses. This is what we call positive distortions in the economy. It creates that circular movement of wealth around the economy. I won't touch on some of the others, just in the interest of time. What I will discuss, though, is just quickly about zakat. Zakat is normally viewed by us as a charitable deed, which is correct, but it should also be viewed as a wealth tax, because this is the way an economic structure works. It's the most efficient way of moving money around. Islamic partnerships are very interesting because we have different models of organizations here, such as Mudaraba, Musharaka, and so forth. What all of these have in common is the transference between capital and effort in equal measure. So people without money can actually start owning businesses. And there's a great velocity behind which capital transfers to effort in either direction. And as we saw previously, that capital is one of the driving factors behind inequality in the society. So something like this is a great resolution to that. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on the past about how we've done this with WAPs and what different scholars have said already about this, but I want to concentrate on some of the more contemporaneous examples of this. Things like the Asas program in Pakistan, for example, which was started in the 1990s. It's a stipend for agricultural workers. It's something that's actually something that's in play today, but in various guises. Despite the trials and tribulations of that country and the corruptions that have happened, it's something that is self-fulfilling, and it's something that is a model for us to use maybe moving forward. Also, the transference of zakat. For example, Malaysian zakat is used for drought relievance in somewhere like Kenya. So that's how we need to start looking across geographical boundaries for the application and the collection of zakat purposes. But the country where I've seen the most effective use of zakat is, again, Indonesia, because it has the highest collection ratio of zakat in the world, and the way it uses their zakat is not just for, quote-unquote charitable needs, but it uses it as part of its economic model to maintain its infrastructure, to start new development projects. And that's the way really zakat needs to be used within our countries. But it's not just Muslims who have done a lot of work on this, it's also other people. Amartya Sen did a lot of work on this, using state as a guarantee of employment, for example, whereby he brought 100 million people out of poverty in South India. We need to, with modern technology and AI, we need to understand about protecting workers, not just the jobs that they're in. And Ingrid Robbins came up with this concept of libertarianism, which is providing a ceiling for the amount of wealth or the amount of income a person can get. Now, this may sound contentious, but we still can't take it out of that debate within Islam. We need to examine it in a bit more depth as to whether this is applicable or not. And some of these company structures are here because they closely resemble some of the structures that we previously talked about. And this is just to show that large enterprises can grow because of this. So this is a favorite example of mine. It's called the Half House by an architect called Alejandro Aravena. It's about building social housing, but building only half of it to make it affordable, but allowing the agency for the occupants to complete it at the cost and time of their choosing. So just to conclude, we've often as Muslims made this kind of Faustian pact with capitalism, because capitalism is ubiquitous and is pervasive all around us. But we need to understand that when we take on the most nefarious aspects of capitalism, like the unadulterated, allocation of property rights, or warped incentive structures, or riba as a tool of political economy, we need to understand that these have consequences for us. And we shouldn't be sleepwalking into some of these presumptions. We need to understand that Islam has a rich history of some of these aspects and dealing with them. And it's almost embarrassing that we don't go back to our rich heritage to address the modern problems of today. I'll just leave you with that quote, but Jazakallah khair. That's it.
Thank you so much, Riaz. You're actually 2 minutes ahead of schedule.
Oh, okay.
So now we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. Who has any questions? Oh, okay. One hand. You might just need 4 minutes to sort out the language model. So I saw that hand first, and then we'll go in the middle to.
Assalamu
So.
Should be. I think so.
Jazakallah khair for the very insightful talk. So, looking at the Muslim world and seeing how most of the Muslim countries have inherited this capitalistic model in their economics to the point where they are sort of contradicting these economic principles outlined in our Sharia, it does seem to me that we are still in a sort of age of colonialism, and we are still to some extent submitted to a Western worldview and a Western model for how to do things. And so I wonder how we can get a sense of power and dignity in our traditions. And I know that Algeria, I believe, is one of the most equal countries in the world. And unlike South Africa, they had a much more perhaps vehement opposition to the colonial might, and they stood their ground. It's just some would say in a more militant stance, but because they did that, they were able to force their paradigm in the way onto their own structures and build their society completely in how they wanted it to be. So, is there anything that we can learn from this sort of history in how to build towards Islamic economics?
Do you want to take another question, or should I answer that? Well, let me answer that first anyway. So just firstly, before I answer that, just a quick shout out to some of my co-collaborators on here, which I failed to signify before. Professor Abdullah Nadei from New York University and Stern School of Management, Professor Mahmoud Asitai from Durham University, Kashif Jilani from Islamic University of Islamabad, and Samuel Dagestani from Lund University in Sweden. Just coming back to that question, I think it's important that we understand that we have to live in this society as we are today, in this contemporaneous world where capital is all around us, but we also have to live aside from it. And most of the work that's been done within this Islamic quote-unquote framework has been done on a very micro level, or just concerning finance as such. It hasn't looked at the overall picture of economics, which is mainly to do with human beings and to do with labor and industrialization in our countries. And that's something I think we need to focus on, because often there's a heavy reliance on talking about Islamic finance and Islamic economics within the same breath. And I think we need to make that distinction, firstly. And secondly, it's about political economy, I think, more than anything else. We need to understand that, for example, that we talked about, and what you've suggested, is the colonial inheritance that we have in some of these countries have actually driven us towards certain directions. Example of Pakistan is one, but an example of Algeria that you just mentioned is maybe different. But we need to understand how to roll back some of those heritages and then proceed as we need to moving forward, I think. So I think it's a long piece of research, but I think the more questions we raise about this, like you have done, I think those are the things that kind of will define how we get at the eventual answers moving forward.
So I also saw that hand right on the left first.
So much for your talk, it's very inspiring. I love how you picked on the four sources of the state, zakat, jizya, ushur and kharaj, and how it can fund the Bayt al-Mal, and how the state will increase equality, right? So I've got two sort of questions that link to that. Number one, do you think that replacing the fiat currency with the gold standard would result in a similar result, and do you think that's practical? And then the second question was, you're addressing all of these economic policies that Islam has. Do you believe that these economic policies can exist within the current status quo, which would mean that, so for example, we've seen that in Turkey where, for example, Erdogan, in the name of morality and Islamic economics, he reduced the interest rates, and that basically led to an economic failure. So do you think it can exist in the current paradigm, or would we need to basically replace this status quo paradigm? So,
Jazakallah khair. So firstly, concerning the monetary standard, gold and fiat, I think if you meet any sort of Muslim economist, there will be huge debates about this topic, whether one is allowed, one is not allowed. I don't think I can do it justice now, even within the people that we've talked about, my co-collaborators, there's always debate around the fiat standard and the gold standard. So maybe we can speak afterwards about that, because it has many dimensions. I'm of the opinion that actually the gold standard is not stipulated within Islam. My opinion is that we can easily have a fiat standard within Islam and make it work, right? But that's an opinion. People have different opinions on that, and there are many dimensions to that opinion. It needs a proper discussion around monetary policy to give it any sort of justice. The second question is about how we can implement some of these structures within the world today. So if you look at, for example, Syria is a really interesting example now, because since the overthrow of the Assad regime, it's almost like a test bed, it's almost like ground zero now in Syria, whereby some of the allocation of policies and some of the way they're looking at things is very interesting in terms of how we manage an economy, how we look at foreign direct investment, how we look at industrialization. It's almost starting from ground zero. So we can see the seeds of something springing up there, and it will be very interesting to understand the progress of that. But you're right, we can't live aside from the world because we need to interact with the world, we need to trade with the world. But we should also understand what are the dimensions of that, what are the guardrails that we need to put around these societies. And I think Indonesia is a good example because it's doing a lot of the things right, but it's very rarely talked about in many ways. Erdogan's example, you're very correct about riba and trying to reduce riba in that manner that caused a number of economic problems. And I agree that those kind of piecemeal interactions with the economic policy are not fruitful. Right? We need to look at it more holistically.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Is my mic on?
Is there enough time for one more question?
Unfortunately not. So sorry.
Okay, fine. We'll talk later, inshallah.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. There's no more time for any questions at the moment, but our speakers will be around during the day, so please do reach out to them and engage in discussion. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to take your questions here tonight.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.